What you're watching is a natural process called diffusion, the spreading of molecules from areas of high concentration to areas of lower concentration. In this case, molecules of smoke spreading from an area of high concentration into the air. The process of diffusion, or spreading, is vital to all life. We know that all living things are made up of cells, and for life to continue, cells must rely upon diffusion to grow and divide. It's an ever-constant process requiring energy, and in order to get that energy, cells must take in nutrients and expel waste. Diffusion is the cell's means of doing exactly that. Molecules of needed food are diffused into the cell through the cell membrane. And in the same way, molecules of waste are diffused out. What this means is simply that you and I and all other living things could not exist without diffusion.
The human lung is a good example of diffusion. It's made up of millions of tiny airways. At the end of each of these is a microscopic air sac where diffusion occurs. Each sac is hollow, and it fills with air and empties every time you breathe, all because of diffusion. The walls of the sac are only a cell thick and surrounded by capillaries carrying blood cells. The oxygen in the air sacs is diffused through the walls into the blood cells where it's carried to all parts of the body. At the same time, carbon dioxide, a waste product, is diffused through the walls from the blood cells into the air sacs to be exhaled. The exchange goes on thousands of times a day in all of us. Here, diffusion is taking place in living lung tissue. You can see the blood cells circulating around the air sacs. Each air sac contains a higher percentage of oxygen than the blood, so oxygen diffuses out of the air sacs into the blood. Now the blood is pumped throughout the body. While circulating through the body, the oxygen in the blood diffuses into the cells, and carbon dioxide produced in the cells diffuses back into the blood to be carried back to the lungs, where it diffuses into the air sacs and is exhaled.
Important as it is in maintaining life, the diffusion process is an amazingly simple one. In most cases, it simply involves the natural flow of molecules spreading out, moving from areas of high concentration to areas of less concentration. Usually, the cell takes no active part in the process. It's simply there while diffusion is taking place. This type of diffusion is called passive transport, since the cell is not actively involved. Sometimes cells do expend energy to move materials in and out through their membranes. For example, these white blood cells use energy to surround and destroy foreign invaders in your body. And these specialized cells in the human intestines use wave-like motions to pull in nutrients. Little bubble-like pockets of the membrane enclose outside materials and bring them into the cell. You've just seen two examples where the cell is involved in moving molecules. But in most cases, the cell's just there. Remember, the cell plays no active part in passive diffusion. It just happens to be in an environment where diffusion is constantly going on. To understand what actually does make diffusion happen, we first have to understand what we call energy of motion.
Now, there are three states of matter: solids, liquids, and gases. Energy of motion simply means that the atoms and molecules in all three are in constant motion. Now, in solids, like this brick, it's a minimal amount of motion because the molecules of a solid are very tightly bonded together. Now, in liquids, the molecular bonds are looser, so the molecules move around more. Now, gas molecules are bonded very loosely, so there's a maximum amount of motion. Solids can't diffuse with each other because their molecules are too tightly bonded to mix. But liquids and gases can diffuse freely. Now, since water can exist in all three states of matter, solid, liquid, and steam or gas, it serves as a good example of the energy of motion.
If we could see the water molecules in ice, we'd see that they are in motion, even if only a little. They stay close together, though. If we add heat, increasing the energy of motion, the molecules start to move faster. And the faster they move, the harder they hit each other, knocking each other farther apart and weakening the attraction between them until they're moving freely in all directions. At this point, ice becomes water, a liquid. As more heat is added, the molecules move even faster. The collisions are harder and they fly even farther apart. Now the water has evaporated into a gas which diffuses into the surrounding air. But molecules are much too small to be seen. How do we know molecules are in motion? If we put larger bits of matter like smoke particles in completely still air and watch them through a microscope, they seem to move on their own. But actually, invisible air molecules knock them around. We call this visible movement of the large particles Brownian movement. Brownian movement is different from many organized motions we normally see. These follow definite patterns. Brownian movement, however, as illustrated by these beads, is unorganized. It's random, like the motion of the smoke particles. And these are particles of paint in liquid. Milk droplets. And particles in living cells. All are moving because they are being bombarded by smaller, invisible particles. The small beads represent these invisible molecules and their constant motion. The large blue bead is being pushed about by collisions with the many small beads. In a similar way, the milk droplets are also being pushed about by invisible water molecules. And since molecules move faster as the temperature rises and slower as the temperature drops, heat and cold directly influence the time it takes for diffusion to take place. So it's these random collisions of molecules that are responsible for the diffusion process.
movement of a specially marked bead shows that each molecule stays more or less in place until more space becomes available. The movement of molecules from where they're concentrated to where they're less concentrated is called diffusion. In these experiments, diffusion is indicated by the spreading color. The dye is more concentrated in the center and less concentrated in the surrounding areas. When molecules are closely packed together, there will be many collisions. Diffusion occurs when the collisions of closely packed molecules causes them to move apart. Eventually, the molecules become equally distributed throughout the available space. The same thing happens when more than one substance is involved. Each substance diffuses from where it's concentrated to where it's less concentrated. If we add a few drops of highly concentrated dye to a flask of water and do not stir it, diffusion will still take place. The concentrated molecules of dye will move to areas of less concentration. After several hours, all molecules will be evenly distributed. That's diffusion. We have placed purple crystals in water. As the solid crystals dissolve, the molecules will move between the water molecules and diffuse from areas of high concentration at the bottom of the cylinder to areas of lower concentration near the top. The diffusion process takes 18 hours to complete. The dye molecules and water molecules collide and disperse until both are equally distributed. Materials diffuse more quickly through gases than they did through water because their molecules are more widely spaced. If we break this bulb containing a colored gas, bromine, in a cylinder of air, the colored bromine vapor takes only 23 minutes to completely diffuse. Remember that gas molecules move rapidly and more freely than molecules of liquid. So materials diffuse faster through them because they're less concentrated. They do offer some resistance, though. These yellow dots illustrate the air molecules in the cylinder. When we released the bromine, the air molecules obstructed the bromine molecules to some degree, but not as much as water molecules would. Suppose there weren't any air molecules to offer resistance. If our theory is correct, the bromine should diffuse much faster. After pumping all the air out of the cylinder, we'll try it again. Diffusion is almost instantaneous.
In a living cell, however, diffusion takes place mostly through solutions instead of gases. So let's define a solution. Simply put, a solution is a mixture of solids or solutes with liquids or solvents. And the concentration of the solution depends upon the ratio of the solid to the liquid. The more solute you have in a given volume of water, the higher the concentration of that solution.
For example, we have 3 cylinders. The marbles represent the solute. This one is about 1/4 or 25% full of solute. This one's about 1/2 or 50% full. And as you can see, this one's about 75% full. Now, if we fill each with a liquid, water, we'll have both solute and solvent in each cylinder. Now in this case, the cylinder contains 25% solutes, so it's a 25% solution. Now here it contains 50% solutes, so it's a 50% solution. And this one is a 75% solution. Now obviously, this less concentrated solution has more water in it than this concentrated one. Now we've done this first with marbles to let you see the amount of solvent and solute in each container. But in an actual solution, the solutes are dissolved. So in this container, we have about 5% salt. Now if we fill up the other 95% with water, we'll have a real solution. The solutes will dissolve. And this is a 5% salt solution.
Now you'll remember that we mentioned earlier that solids can't diffuse. That holds true if they remain in a solid state. But once they're dissolved in a liquid, however, their molecules are separated by the reaction with the liquid, and they can then diffuse. Now if for some reason the liquid is removed from a solution, the molecules rejoin and become solids again. These are crystals which we first dissolved into a solution and then let the solvent evaporate.
It's solutions then, solutes plus solvents, that diffuse in and out of cells through the cell membrane. The most important function of the cell membrane is to select and control materials passing in and out of the cells. Actually, it acts as somewhat of a barrier.
Some barriers don't allow anything to pass through them. We call these impermeable barriers. Others allow some or all particles to pass through. And a barrier that allows all particles to move through it is called permeable. Particles can move through permeable barriers in both directions. Living cells, too, are surrounded by barriers which keep the material inside the cell from mixing with the material outside. In cells, the barriers are very thin membranes which allow only certain things to pass through under certain conditions. These are called selectively permeable barriers. Inside this beaker are living yeast cells. And in this beaker are dead yeast cells. We'll soak them both in a dye, a solute. After a time, the dye has stained the dead cells, but the live cells have remained clear. This is because living cell membranes allow only the essential substances to diffuse through, while other substances are kept out. In other words, cell membranes are selectively permeable. If they were not, nutrients could not get into the cell and waste products could not get out. Both solutes and solvents may diffuse through cell membranes.
With this experiment, we can illustrate how water alone passes through a membrane. We place an egg containing protein and water in a sac much like a cell membrane. The egg represents a living cell. When we place the sac in water, it swells. Water molecules have diffused in, but the egg molecules are too large to diffuse out. The membrane is selective. The white dots represent water. The black dots represent protein molecules. Outside the sac are only molecules of water. Water then is more concentrated outside than inside. So water diffuses through the membrane into the sac. The diffusion of water through a membrane is called osmosis. Here's another example. This thistle tube contains a dyed sugar solution. The dish contains water. A selectively permeable membrane separates the tube. Within a few minutes, the water level rises in the tube, but none of the dye has entered the water, because its molecules are too large. Osmosis took place because more water molecules hit the membrane from the lower side, where the water is concentrated, than from the upper side, where the water is less concentrated because of the presence of dye. Therefore, more water will move in this direction than in this direction. So water, like other substances, moves from where it's more concentrated to where it's less concentrated. Notice that this membrane is selectively permeable because the smaller water molecules are able to pass through, while the larger blue dye molecules are not.
We can see some of the effects osmosis has on live cells in a few experiments. The concentration of pure water inside these red blood cells is about equal to that outside the cells. This is what we call osmotic balance. We can upset that balance by adding more pure water around the cells. Now, with the concentration of pure water higher outside the cells, they begin to expand as water diffuses in. Finally, the pressure becomes too great and the cells burst. We can bring osmosis about in plant cells too. But let's make water move out of the cells this time. If we surround these algal cells with a salt solution, there is less pure water outside the cells than inside. So water diffuses from inside the cell, where it's more concentrated, to outside the cell, where it's less concentrated, and the cell shrinks. The force that water creates on living cells is called osmotic pressure, and it's stronger than you might think. These are dried beans being mixed with wet plaster. The plaster is then allowed to harden and placed in water. The water will diffuse in, swelling the beans and breaking the plaster. Plants use the force of osmotic pressure for many functions. There are really two different types of diffusion that can occur through membranes. We've been discussing osmosis, which is the diffusion of water through a membrane. The other kind of diffusion is the diffusion of solutes through a membrane. This is called dialysis. Dialysis is just as necessary for the life of a cell as is osmosis. Cells have to take in nutrients, which are generally in the form of solutes, and they have to expel waste. Cells accomplish this by dialysis. Since a cell is diffusing both water and solutes at all times, both osmosis and dialysis occur simultaneously.
This colored iodine solution was prepared by dissolving iodine crystals in water. The light-colored solution is starch. Here's what happens when iodine and starch combine. It turns dark blue. This container is divided by an artificial membrane, which again is very similar to a cell membrane. Let's see if iodine molecules, solute, can diffuse through the membrane to starch. Time-lapse shows that they do. You can tell by the dark blue color. Only the solid particles of iodine are small enough to diffuse through the membrane from the left, where they're more concentrated, to the right, where they're less concentrated. The larger starch particles are blocked. Dialysis is the diffusion of solutes through a selectively permeable membrane. This woman's kidneys have failed. Because kidney cells perform a vital function of dialysis, the removal of waste solutes from the blood, she must have her blood artificially cleansed on this dialysis or kidney machine. Her blood flows out of her body through a coil, which simulates cell membranes. The coil is surrounded by dialysis fluid. as waste solutes diffuse out of the blood to areas of less concentration in the surrounding clear fluid. And the cleansed blood flows back into her body.
The kidney machine is only one example of diffusion at work. Diffusion, remember, is basically just the spreading out of molecules from areas of high concentration to areas of less concentration. Eventually, the molecules are equally distributed. Energy of motion means that the molecules in solids, liquids, and gases are always moving. Though we can't actually see molecules, we can see the effect their movements have on larger particles. And we know it's the random collision between these molecules that cause them to diffuse. Solutions are made up of two things, solutes and solvents. Cells are surrounded by a membrane which acts as a selectively permeable barrier. It allows only certain liquids and solids to diffuse through it. When water alone diffuses through a selectively permeable cell membrane, we call it osmosis. And when solutes diffuse through a selectively permeable membrane, we have a different name for it, dialysis.
All of which adds up to the fact that diffusion is an extremely vital function of life. Even in the very beginning, it allows the first life-giving exchange of oxygen and nutrients between mother and embryo. And from the very first moment of life, diffusion continues in every cell of every living thing on Earth.